net zero CO2 emissions has become a big thing, and many countries and companies have net zero targets. Carbon dioxide, climate is more of a permanent. So if you pollute the lake, it stays polluted, and it's very, very hard to unpollute it. We're so focused on the net zero elements, then we're maybe not putting enough focus on the reducing the emissions in the short term. Generally, the whole point of climate policy is to get emissions to zero. If we stopped emitting CO2, the blanket stays, the blanket doesn't go away, so the planet will still be warmer. So black carbon has a very strong short-term effect, and black carbon is essentially from incomplete combustion. So you burn some fossil fuel, but you don't do a good job. China's very close to this tipping point where renewables will be sufficient, and China won't need to build much new coal. Wind power, solar, electric vehicles, batteries as a cost. We should think of it as progress, as investment.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Science Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Mohammed Itefaq. Today, I will be talking with Glen Peters. Glen is a senior researcher at the Center for International Climate Research. He's expert in the area of energy, emissions, all sort of emissions, and climate change. Glen, welcome to Science Talk.
Thank you. It's great to meet you and join you.
Thank you so much. So let's start with the Paris Agreement. It's been 10 years. It's a 10th anniversary of a Paris Agreement. Are we celebrating?
Oh, yeah, I guess there's going to be elements of celebration and elements of, well, maybe disappointment is the right word. Um, so there's not been, well, from depending on your perspective, there's been lots of progress since Paris, but from other perspectives, there hasn't been much progress. So if we think about emissions, total emissions, when you include land use change, so fossil emissions and land use change, emissions are sort of flat. So you could say that's good news in a sense, but they've not peaked and gone down. Fossil emissions, they're still rising, so we're still burning more coal, oil, and gas than we were in 2015. Um, so I guess that's the a little bit of good, a little bit of bad news there. In terms of technologies, solar, wind, electric vehicles, batteries, they've grown extremely fast in the last 10 years, so that's certainly good news. Um, and that's sort of in terms of the outcomes, measurable outcomes, but in terms of, I guess, process, you could say Paris has been successful. It's a different type of regime than the Kyoto Protocol before it. So this is a more bottom-up, country-driven process, and countries are required to put forward their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs as they're called, basically emission pledges on what they'll do in 2030, 2035, and so on. And this has sort of started a process where it sort of elevates the whole climate discussion amongst countries, and this is where action ultimately happens. So I guess that's initiating that process is good, even though it's not led to that much in terms of outcomes, in terms of like reduced emissions and so on. I guess the other element, which has also been, or maybe one that people most recognise, is net zero. So, as a part of the Paris Agreement and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that followed, net zero CO2 emissions has become a big thing, and many countries and companies have net zero targets. Whether that means they reduce their emissions is another question. But again, it's one of these examples of elevating climate on the decision-making agenda, which is good, even if we have not yet seen big outcomes.
So you also do research on net zero, and I want to spend some time or emissions reduction, and I want to talk a little bit about where are we with the net zero? Are we seeing some really tangible steps and things that by 2040, 2050, this would be this much reduction, or we will have a net zero? Or we just kind of talk because some people think it's just a scam. We shouldn't go for the net zero and things like that. But like you're the person who does a lot of research on these areas. So what is the realistic picture right now, and where are we heading with that?
Yeah, so I guess sort of stepping back a little bit, why is net zero important? So carbon dioxide's a cumulative pollutant, so it matters how much you put in the atmosphere, um, and it doesn't decay over time. So often, environmental problems are sort of local pollutants. So if you pollute the lake, then if you stop polluting the lake, then you can clean the lake up after time.
Mhm.
Whereas CO2, carbon dioxide, climate is more of a permanent. So if you pollute the lake, it stays polluted, and it's very, very hard to unpollute it. So because of that, you need to get to net zero emissions. So you need to stop putting the rubbish in the lake or stop putting the rubbish in the atmosphere. And that's sort of the outcome that we want. So it's a very important outcome. Although where we are today in regards to meeting that outcome, where emissions are at best flat. So we've certainly not even started reducing emissions to get towards that target. So progress is very slow, even though that's a place that we need to go to. In some respects, net zero has been a bit of, you could argue, has been a bit of a diversion. People start to focus on, oh, net zero 2050, decades ahead, and not focus on the short term. And to reach that net zero in decades ahead, you need to have emissions going down in the short term. So we've not even achieved that. But because we're so focused on the net zero elements, then we're maybe not putting enough focus on the reducing the emissions in the short term. Then there's this sort of scam aspect that you mentioned. I guess there's different angles to that, but uh, quite often there's a misunderstanding of what net zero means.
Yes.
So many think that you can keep emitting as
Mhm.
long as you have some way to offset that um, through different mechanisms. And quite often, these sort of methods of offsetting don't really offset the emission. So it can sound like someone's reaching net zero when they're not, in fact, meeting net zero. So maybe an example is a flight on an aircraft.
Mhm.
When you buy your ticket, you'll get, oh, do you want to offset your flight? And you can click on a button and pay, I don't know, some small
Mhm.
amount of money, and it will offset your emissions. So when you're on the flight, of course, the carbon dioxide is still going into the atmosphere, so nothing has changed. But there's some transaction in the background which claims to offset those emissions, and quite often they don't. Um, and so this is where you start to get into those scam um, directions. You could get, better or worse offsets, but generally the whole point of climate policy is to get emissions to zero. Um, and offsetting is something, it can happen in some contexts, but it's usually a very limited, um, the scale is quite limited. You can't offset all our emissions.
So what about because recently when I talked with Dr. Gerald Kutney, he's from Canada, about climate denial and climate politics. I received a lot of nasty comments in the video on YouTube saying that, like, if you're saying take CO2 from the atmosphere, you're saying that freeze to death. We're gonna freeze. This planet gonna go back to ice age. Can you once for all um, address that myth that if we go to net zero does not mean that we will go back to ice age?
Yeah, so it's a sort of interesting science question in there. So before humans, there was CO2 in the atmosphere, around about 270 parts per million was the number, and that acts as a blanket. So if we didn't have that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, um, the Earth would actually be an ice ball. So, but we have, fortunately, some CO2 in the atmosphere, and that acts as a blanket. And this is one of the reasons that we know about CO2 and the way it works. So, by taking carbon from geological deep Earth carbon and putting it in the atmosphere, the atmospheric concentration has risen. It's now about 425 parts per million. I think that's about 60% higher than what it was earlier. So that layer around the planet is a little bit thicker, if you like, than what it was before, and so the planet has warmed. This is the most basic part of climate science that there is. And when you go to zero, and so the more we emit, the more we build up that planet, and the
Yeah.
warmer it will get. When you go to net zero, you basically stop at um, that level of warming.
Mhm.
So if we got to net zero emissions and there was 500 parts per million in the atmosphere,
Mhm.
so a quite thick blanket, that blanket basically remains. So that blanket doesn't go away. There are now methods where you can take carbon back out of the atmosphere, but it's generally small scale. And I don't think that anyone is really proposing in a seriousness that it would be possible to remove carbon from the atmosphere to get back to the pre-industrial 270 parts per million. The volume is just too immense.
Mhm.
It's yeah, it's trillions of tons of carbon that's been put into the atmosphere. Um, and then to get it to an ice ball Earth again would require removing even more CO2, which no one has ever, as far as I know, proposed. But even if you tried to do that, you will get a response from the system.
Mhm.
And this is so if you think about the system wants to move to equilibrium, a stable point of view. Um, so if you start to remove carbon from the atmosphere, then the ocean and the land system change to put carbon back in the atmosphere. So you're always fighting against
Mhm.
nature, trying to find a new equilibrium. Um, yeah, so I'm not sure what sort of word I'd use, but it's basically impossible to get to an ice ball Earth situation. And if we stopped, if we stopped emitting CO2, the blanket stays, the blanket doesn't go away, so the planet will still be warmer. It will not just cool down and stop.
Looking at the scale of emissions, 2025, 2024, or over the last 5, 10 years, it's been record high every year. We're breaking the record. Um, are you still hopeful that we will stop emitting, or we will level these emissions in near future? It doesn't look like, but what is the data? What are the projections? Or what is the realistic picture and what is the optimistic picture of those emissions?
Yeah, I think we've been thinking emissions would peak in the next few years for the last 10 years, but it never
Right.
happens. So this is sort of an interesting question because on one hand, we have this rapid growth in solar and wind and so on, and it's grown to such a level we would have expected, I think, by now that the incremental new demand in energy would be met by renewable sources, but it sort of just keeps being one of those goals which is always just a little bit further away, and we never seem to get there. You would expect, within the next few years, these dynamics might catch up. But I've been saying that for 10 years, so I need to be cautious
Mhm.
there. But there's a few sort of factors which are pushing things in the other direction. So electrification is one important thing. So we use a lot more electricity. Electricity is growing much faster than I suspect people would have assumed 10 years ago. And usually when we think of electrification, we think that we have some inefficient industrial process using coal, for example, and then we electrify it and it becomes more efficient. So the sort of starting assumption is that electrification would reduce emissions. But what I think that we see is there's a whole lot of new uses of electricity. So as we electrify, electricity sort of expectation it will become cheaper and cheaper because of solar and wind and so on. Then more and more people will have air conditioning, electricity consumption goes up. We have, this current issue with data centers and
Mhm.
artificial intelligence, and,
Yeah.
that's using more electricity. High tech manufacturing uses a lot of electricity. So there's just this rapid growth in electricity demand,
Mhm.
which that's that sort of thing that keeps pulling away from us. So the solar is
Mhm.
growing really fast and it's trying to reach the electricity consumption, but the electricity consumption just keeps stepping up a little bit more than we had expected. But at some stage, those dynamics should catch up. It just takes time. These are big electricity systems, a lot of inertia. It takes time for infrastructure to turn over and so on. Eventually, coal power plants will retire and so on. And so we would expect, just on these dynamics, a peak in emissions soonish, but it just keeps seeming to be elusive.
Mhm.
So within the next few years, I'd expect emissions to level out and hopefully soon after that decline. But I mean, this has been said many times before, so need
It's
to be appropriately cautious.
it's interesting because on the one hand, we tell ordinary people to reduce their energy consumption or preserve water, but on the other hand, these companies are building gigantic data centers consuming more energy than the entire city. And on the one hand, we're talking about moving toward more renewable sources. On the other hand, we just keep increasing the electricity use for ridiculous reasons, honestly, to me. Do we really need these big data tech companies and AI systems to be using this much energy and water and polluting the air and the water and coming up with more diseases and coming up with more polluted waters and airs? What are we doing?
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you. I guess, it's sort of an interesting tension. So there's this element that, let's say, the average consumer household, let's say us, we might try and conserve a bit of a water or electricity
Mhm.
here and there, but that is just totally, completely blown out of the water. Bit of a pun there, but completely blown away from increased use in, let's say, data centers or wherever. So you have that contradiction. Um, we all want electricity to be cheaper,
Absolutely.
and therefore, people will complain when the price is high. But electricity is sufficiently cheap, I guess, that people, well, big companies at least, don't see it as a barrier to use in huge amounts of electricity. So there's something in the system here that's not getting the right signal. So for the household level, electricity is too expensive, but it's not a problem for a big IT tech
Mhm.
company to build how many ever data centers they need. That the cost associated with that is somehow socialized so well that that cost to them seems negligible. So I don't know, like the standard economic approach would be, oh, there'll be a price and people will respond to the price, but big companies have so much buying power
Mhm.
that the price is irrelevant, it
Yeah,
seems
especially
to
in the
them.
US, especially in the US, they can buy anything
Yeah,
with their billions and trillions, you know.
yeah.
Um,
So it's sort of, in a sense, yeah, I think many countries are grappling with this. You need some sort of, I don't know, prioritization or, if you think about it in a more central planning way, if we've got this much electricity, what's the best way to utilize that electricity to enhance social welfare, if you like? And the answer would probably not be, oh, just have more data centers.
mhm. Yeah.
There'll be a much more nuanced discussion around that. But how you implement this in a policy context, I think, is the next. It's very difficult, and I think countries are trying all sorts of different things. Many of them silly. Norway has a fixed price that they've just implemented from the governmental level, which subsidizes everyone's electricity use. So this is responding to people complaining about the price, but doesn't in any way address the issue of supply or data centers or that sort of stuff. Um, Australia has so much solar now that they're giving
Mhm.
people free electricity in the middle of the day, um, to try and shift behaviour in a sense and gives some signal that, well, renewables are cheap. Look, it's
Mhm.
free even during the day. But this again doesn't solve these big industrial problems
Yeah.
of the demand. So I think policymakers are struggling with how to find the solution there. And they're sold the promise that AI is going to solve everything, which I'm not sure is correct. Um, and so there's probably an overinvestment
So
in
coming back
these
to Mhm.
resources. Mm.
Coming back to carbon emissions, and I recently learned there is a carbon dioxide, but there's also black carbon, there's also brown carbon. And do you have like kind of, like kind of ideas and things? What are those? And there's some people are arguing that black carbon is also a big problem, but we're not talking much about it. So like what kind of like emission do you kind of project and understand, and like are we also talking about black and brown carbon?
Yeah, so climate is affected by many pollutants. So CO2 is the sort of the main one, and the real challenge with CO2 is this permanent nature of it.
Mhm.
Um, so it's in a class of its own in a sense, but there's a whole bunch of other species emissions that cause warming. The next most important one is methane.
Mhm.
So methane is relatively short-lived. It stays in the atmosphere for 10, 20 years. And so the climate effect, let's say, lasts for, let's say, 50 years, um, because the ocean's a bit slower. But that has a very strong short-term warming effect. So you get lots of benefits. You can decrease the temperature from methane by reducing methane emissions. So things like eating less meat, for example, is an extremely effective
Mm.
policy tool to help reduce emissions. After methane, there's some other greenhouse gases that people would have heard of, like nitrous oxide,
Mhm.
fluorinated gases like SF6 and HFCs, and so on. They're generally long-lived and so a bit more like carbon dioxide, but they're generally quite small. And then there's a whole range of um, generally you would say air pollutants of different sorts, each which has rather specific climate effects, but they're often very short term and they're often easy to clean up. So black carbon has a very strong short term effect. And black carbon is essentially from incomplete combustion. So you burn some fossil fuel, but you don't do a good job. So if you think of someone getting in their truck, particularly
Mhm.
when it's cold, and rev it up and the black smoke comes flying out the top,
Yeah.
there's your sort of black carbon, essentially. And so you can pretty easily clean, and it's also bad for health, I should say. You
Mhm.
breathe in the particles and it's bad for your lungs. And so these pollutants are pretty important to clean up purely for health reasons. They have a very strong short-term climate effect. And so there's a climate benefit. Um, and they're generally easy to clean up. So you just have a more efficient engine.
Mhm.
It's good for your more efficient energy is also good for your wallet because you use less fuel, which people have not quite understood
Mhm.
yet. But so it's one of these win-win-win-win type situations, which is why Europe, the US have in particular, and now we see China and other developing countries have put in huge efforts to cleaning up local air pollutants,
Mhm.
um, sulfur dioxide, black carbon, these things which generally come from incomplete and poor combustion. There's also elements which have a cooling effect, so organic carbon um, is one, I guess a class of brown carbon. Which has a cooling effect. So that's more coming from bioenergy type sources. Um, and there's other air pollutants, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, which have chemical reactions in the atmosphere. So they're not directly causing climate change, but they have chemical reactions with it within the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is a chemical, and you put another chemical in there, and they react, and that's the result of those reactions. Species that cause more warming, often through a methane process. It's often related to methane. So but many of these things aren't, these short-term components aren't regulated via climate policy. They'll be regulated by general air pollution type policy, um, but they have a climate benefit. And there's so many interesting elements to this. You know, even if you go into the US, which is particularly polarized,
Mhm.
I would hope that across the political spectrum that you could get agreement that some form of air pollutants should be reduced and are beneficial for your health of individuals. And there's a very clear case, and it just so happens that there's a climate benefit. So that's just a co-benefit. But you would reduce these things for public health reasons. China, in the last 10, 20 years, the reductions in sulfur emissions and a lot of these local air pollutants in China has been dramatic. So, you went to China 20 years ago, you couldn't see the sky. You go to China now, you can see the
Yeah.
sky. So these benefits are huge, huge benefits in terms of public health.
Are there like ways to reduce emissions from the atmosphere naturally? There's a natural cycle because there is a lot of talks about photosynthesis and also like carbon sinks and all that, and also carbon direct carbon capture stuff. There's like, technology, human-made method we can try to reduce emissions, but there's like some organic, and a lot of people talk about volcanic eruption and like, and if it just, do that. And so are there ways, and like what are some of the possibilities that naturally if we emit more, there might be some sort of, natural event would take more CO2 from the emission which a human possibly can.
Yeah, so it's good to split this into sort of, as you say, the natural components and the human
Mhm.
components. So so there's the natural carbon cycle. So when we put carbon into the atmosphere, if we put 100 units of carbon into the atmosphere, about 25 goes back into the ocean, about 25 gets taken up in the land,
Mhm.
and about 50 stays in the atmosphere. They're just coarse numbers, rounded a little bit. But so basically, the ocean and land system clean up about half what we put in the atmosphere. So that's the natural carbon cycle. And this also comes back to what we're talking about net zero before. One of the scams that is commonly referred to is when people or companies use that natural carbon cycle to offset emissions. It doesn't make sense to do that in any way. You get no gains if you offset your fossil emissions with these natural carbon uptake. So that's the natural carbon cycle. We can take something a little bit related to the natural carbon cycle, and you can think of growing trees, so planting trees and growing trees, or restoring existing forests and so on. That takes carbon out of the atmosphere, and so it helps remove carbon over and above that natural component that I mentioned. Although it's not in a permanent storage, so it's still vulnerable. So it's on the land surface, and maybe a fire could come along, maybe a chainsaw could come along, and so it could be released again. And then there's a whole range of other more technological human interventions that you can do. Um, and I'll just quickly touch on some of them. One is you can grow trees, harvest the trees, so bioenergy, but capture the CO2 when you burn the trees. Um, so bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, it's called this. So via the tree and the industrial process of removing carbon, you can store carbon. You put the carbon back in the ground in like old depleted oil reservoirs and that sort of stuff. There's processes where you can break up rocks, and rocks over millions of years take up carbon. Um, but you can speed up that process by crushing the rocks into smaller components, and that can take up carbon. Um, you can do a sort of a fertilization of the ocean and help the ocean take up more carbon. Very hard to verify what's natural and what's because of your fertilization. There's various soil things you can do. And so to try and take up more carbon in the soil, again, that's not one of those permanent ones. It's a little bit vulnerable that you could disturb it again. And then there's direct air capture, where you can use a machine essentially to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. Um, it sounds very clean as a technology, but it uses a lot of energy. Um, uh, so it's not a very effective way. It's very costly. So it uses a lot of energy. It costs a lot. It's a fairly complex process, but it's possible. So some models will show this sort of technology scaling up throughout the century, but there's no sort of large scale facilities that do this. There's various ideas for it, but it's very energy and resource intensive.
So the best case scenario is that we don't emit. So we don't get into this problem,
Yeah,
or we emit as less as possible, so we don't get into this complicated cycle, so we don't have to struggle or come up with the genius ideas of geoengineering or solar radiation or other methods to try these, and we don't know how the
yeah,
ecosystem or overall is gonna react
yeah,
as our systems are becoming more sensitive.
yeah.
So the carbon budget, that's another thing which exists, right? What are the carbon budgets and which countries are doing better job than others? And if you can just explain what a carbon budget is and what is going on with that.
Yeah. So, yeah, just to your first point there, reducing emissions is by far the cheapest and easiest way to get emissions down, as opposed to doing this really complex and difficult, expensive stuff of removing it once you've put it there. Um, and it's just hands down better. um, but yeah, so carbon budget. Um, so the global, well, a carbon budget generally, the way it's used or discussed is because I was talking about this relationship between CO2 emissions and temperature. Basically, the temperature is dependent on the total amount of CO2 that you put in the atmosphere, and we can do detailed calculations to figure out how much carbon you can put in the atmosphere and what the temperature outcomes will be. And so we can figure out that if we wanted to stay below 2 degrees, then that would mean a certain amount of carbon in the atmosphere. We know we've already put this certain amount in the atmosphere. We can measure that quite accurately. Therefore, the difference between the two is like a carbon budget, how much we can emit in the future to stay below a certain temperature level, at which point then you would be zero emissions. And different countries, this is used a lot globally, and different countries have different, I would say, incarnations of this concept. So you can sort of translate a carbon budget into emission reductions. So this is just simple geometry.
Mhm.
The carbon budget is sort of the area under the curve. And so if you have a curve, you can figure out the carbon budget. But then with the curve, you can say we need to reduce emissions by 20% by this year, 50% by this year, and 80% by that year to stay within your carbon budget. How a country's doing, um, I think the best way to explain that is to sort of separate countries at the most coarse level into developed and developing countries. So most developed countries, rich countries, are reducing their emissions, but there's a context to that. They're developed, which means that their energy consumption is quite flat.
Mhm.
They also have quite old energy infrastructure. So if they have a coal power plant, it's 50 years old, not 5 years old. And so when they install renewables, they've got a coal power plant which is closing, the renewables are replacing it, energy consumption is flat, and so emissions therefore go down. When you come to a developing country context, the country is developing, so
Mhm.
energy consumption is still growing strongly. China, India are classic examples of this. And even though those countries are deploying huge, mind-boggling amounts of solar and wind, it still can't keep up with the growth in energy consumption in those countries. And so emissions are still rising. They have young coal power fleets. So the coal power plants are more like 10 years as opposed to 50 years. Um, and energy consumption is growing so fast that not only do they need the renewables, but they need a little bit of coal or gas, usually coal, on top to meet that total growth in demand. But we're certainly seeing in China that China's very close to this tipping point where renewables will be sufficient and China won't need to build much new coal, or they'll start to turn the coal power plants down. India is a little bit further away, but we're starting to see like renewables growth is still very strong in India. Just to mention another thing which is important, particularly in the China, India, developing country context more generally, is they often deploy solar and wind and
Mhm.
electric vehicles now because it's cheap. Um, they're not doing it, oh, let's go deploy some solar because we're going to save the world from climate change. They're, well, how can I get on the cheapest possible energy? That's solar. We'll deploy solar. So this is one of those good news stories going back to the start that the cost of these technologies are so low that it makes sense to deploy them first, and only if you can't build enough, then put in some coal afterwards. But that's the general dynamics. Rich
Mhm.
countries, flat, declining emissions, but there's a national context, historical context to it. Developing countries, emissions growth we would expect is slower than what it would have been because of the level of renewables being deployed, but not quite peaking or declining yet.
And you also you have expertise on IPCC climate projections and the reports. Are these IPCC reports and projections are usually off? Because a lot of people are really mad at IPCC because they say like they said we're gonna reach 1.5 in 2040, but I look at it's 2025. Of course, it's not a 10 years average or anything. It's like a third year consecutive where we are seeing between 1.4 to 1.6, and they see like IPCC projections are way off or more conservative. Where do you stand on that?
I think the data pretty clearly shows the projections are doing quite well. The part of the challenge is how do you do these comparisons? Because in reality, some years are hotter, some years are colder, some years
Mhm.
it's wet, some years it's dry. So, the temperature goes up and down, but it's going up and down on an increasing line.
Mhm.
And so you'll get a few years that might be a little bit warmer than the average, on the trajectory, and a few years that are a little bit lower than what you would expect from the trajectory. But over time, it
Mhm.
averages out to being on the trajectory. You have the same thing that happens in a climate model. So these climate models also model out all these interannual variability. So climate models also have these warm years and cold years, but the trajectory is the same. So when you do this appropriate averaging over time, balancing out the variability
Mhm.
in the real world and the variability in the models, the models are doing, I think, quite well. Even when we often hear things like, "Oh, the climate impacts are worse than we thought," or whatever. Although when you start to look inside the models, well, actually, the climate models, those projections, I mean, those impacts are in there. They may be just manifesting in a little bit different ways. You might have different events aligning in different ways. You might have, heat and drought align
Mhm.
at the same time, and then a fire comes, and so you have these compound events. So it might make it appear worse than what the models say, but um, most of these sorts of um, we're sort of realizing the world that was predicted is one way to put it. So in that sense, the models are doing quite well. This is the climate models. You also have models of the energy system.
Mhm.
Um, it's much harder to evaluate whether models of the energy system are doing well, sort of in terms of their projections of solar and wind and so on, because there's people involved, there's markets involved, so it doesn't necessarily happen as a theoretical physics
Mhm.
would evolve. But models are also often set up in a way that they seek a target as opposed to trying to model reality. So these energy system models would say things like, what does it take for the world to stay below 1.5 degrees? And you'll see the model has emissions going down and so on. They're not used as much in the context of where is the world heading,
Mm.
even if they are, because policy evolves over time. It's sort of like a moving target. So um, if a country comes in with a new set of policies, that might bend the curve a little bit, and then maybe you get another country that, I don't know, let's say the US pulls out, and then it may bend the curve the other way a little
Mm.
bit. So you have these
Yeah.
constant changes in the policy dynamics. So it's very hard to evaluate how accurate the energy system models are because it's a
Because
moving
of
target.
because of all the political and social, cultural, and financial mm, variables into that, it's just not
Yeah.
black and white. So the basic climate change is that we're burning fossil fuel, emitting the carbon emission, and that's heating the planet, and that heat is warming the ocean, and like kind of heat waves and flooding and unpredictable rain patterns and all that, right? When we're seeing that these fossil fuel companies have been lying and they're still producing more, especially like there are many countries which are like very strange. Like, for example, if you look at Norway and China, right? So China is putting a lot of renewable. In Norway, they have a lot of 100%, 90% renewable, whatever. But at the same time, China is building coal power plant. China is building, more nuclear, and same Norway is still producing fossil fuel to export to the other countries because their economy is still based on that. When you see that, for example, you're based in Norway, right? So you are enjoying the clean air, right? You're living that privilege, but in Pakistan right now, the AQI is 1,000 right now, like literally right now. It's like beyond any level humans can endure. It's bad for your lungs, it's bad for your asthma, it's bad for your itchy eyes, it's bad for your mental health, it's everything. Like 9 million people die due to air pollution every year. How do you see, like, if we see collectively the world is going to address this challenge, but on the one hand, these rich countries are enjoying that lifestyle and the clean air and the water and everything, but on the other hand, India, Pakistan, or many other countries, people are dying because of these air pollutants. So how do you see that we're gonna move forward and making that progress, which is kind of affecting everybody? Of course, climate change is not affecting everybody equally. That's why we're not making as much progress. But on the other hand, developing countries are seeing more challenges with the rising heat waves, with more, sea level rise, with more flooding, with more unpredictable rain patterns. But in these countries, they're enjoying more of, like, they reach their peak emissions, they maybe are turning the curve, they're thinking about that. But on the other hand, there are countries who haven't done anything. There's poverty, there's unemployment, there's like their energy demand is still, they cannot meet the basic needs of the humans in terms of energy sources. How do we grapple with that?
Yes, that's I wish I had a concrete answer to that, but but I mean, there's lots of contradictions which you sort of outlined there, particularly in rich countries, and they all have contradictions of some sort. And so Norway, for example, will boast about how clean its oil production is. So, it's very good at taking oil out of the ground with minimizing emissions, but then will happily sell that oil onto someone else who will then cough on the pollution because of that. And that they would say, not my problem. Um, the country as a general whole political system or whatever. We're part of Paris, we're part of the
Mhm.
EU system. It's all captured, and if you want to buy our oil and breathe in the pollution, at least we produced it with low pollution.
Mhm.
Um, that's the argument they take, which has big contradictions, and they have no intention to slow down. Um, uh, while ever they would argue that while ever there's a demand for oil, then or gas, then they will keep selling the oil and gas. And I guess that's the attitude that most of the rich countries take. Don't want to give up the sort of resource that they were blessed with. Then how do you translate that to a developing country? So you can get into all these, can finance initiatives which developed countries are very resistant to get involved in, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you get that transfer of technology and finance to happen? That's a question I don't have an answer to. Maybe, the answer is coming in the sense that some of these technologies are just cheap.
Mhm.
So if India, for example, wants to build a new uh, provide more power, then the cheapest way will be solar. Actually, I think solar is doing very well in India, in
Mhm.
Pakistan at the moment.
Yes. Mhm.
So, and same with electric vehicles. We're increasingly seeing in developing countries, electric vehicles are being deployed. So, maybe the costs have changed, that this equation changes a little bit. There's this old notion of leapfrogging, that developing countries will leapfrog over the dirty technologies and go straight to the clean technologies. I've always been a little bit skeptical of
Mhm.
this, but maybe we start to see some incarnations of that,
Mhm.
um, where developing countries start to be the ones that are actually the leaders,
Yeah,
and they're
which is
leaders
hard
purely
to
on a
see,
self-interest.
honestly, which is hard to see because it's more of a might is the right kind of situation if you look at the global affairs and the politics and
I
geopolitics.
agree. And it comes back to, you can think about tech companies, huge companies that have huge influence and power, and can change the views of a population with a click of
Exactly.
fingers.
Exactly.
That yeah, it's I don't know how to get out of this. I guess if it was
It's
easy, we
mess.
would have got out of this situation. Yeah,
Yeah.
but there's this, but I mean, broadly speaking, this is an inequality issue. But even when you come to countries like Norway, which are so-called famous for their equality, that you still have very stark inequalities. The rich are still extremely
Yeah.
rich, and the rich are still getting richer extremely fast.
Yeah.
So that distribution of wealth even is not happening within countries. Um, and if it's not happening within countries, it's certainly not happening across countries. Whether there becomes a reckoning at some stage where the citizens start to say, well, this is no longer fair, but then citizens are
And
generally
they're not
within
listening to
the.
citizens. I wish they listen, these
Uh,
democracies listen to citizens. They don't,
no, that's
unfortunately.
right. So
Yeah,
I can only
unfortunately.
agree with you. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah,
my
I
last
don't have a solution.
yeah, my last question, and I always tell my guests that you can have 19 seconds to think about what is something with related to emissions we're still not talking and we should be spending more time talking about is as a scientist or as a societies.
Yeah, I don't really need to think about it. I would just say, uh, generally reducing emissions is a win-win situation.
Mhm.
Um, so maybe you shouldn't, because there's always this, oh, it costs, it costs, it costs, it
Mhm.
costs type argument. But I think that cost is a bit of an artifact. Countries invest in a lot of things. So, investing in a coal power plant is a
Mhm.
cost,
Yeah,
but we don't say, oh,
absolutely.
it's a cost. But
Yeah,
if we say build solar, oh no, solar, that's a cost.
yeah,
And so we've got this narrative in our head that doing things better is a cost, whereas doing things the same is not a cost.
yeah.
They're
That's
both,
what they have been
yeah,
telling us.
yes.
Yeah.
And this sort of comes back to the sort of point that I was sort of make. These technologies are getting cheaper. You should view them as an investment. So
Mhm.
you're investing in your energy infrastructure. It's not a cost; it's an investment. Just like when people buy a car, you're investing
Mhm.
um, in that mobility service or whatever. So it's that sort of reframing things away from a cost and a problematic to we're going to a better world. So if we think about I don't know, mobile telephones. Maybe this is
Mhm.
not true anymore, but I mean, people just naturally went to mobile telephones. We had the old things and dialing and whatever, and now we've naturally gone to these telephones. We haven't thought of it as a cost. They're pretty bloody expensive to go out and buy
Absolutely.
a new phone.
Every year, new iPhone is ridiculous. But yeah.
But we still value, we don't think of it as a cost. We see that we get whatever, and I don't know, computer, IT infrastructure, whatever. Maybe I'm pushing things a little bit too far on some of these analogies here, but therefore we should not think of wind power, solar, electric vehicles, batteries as a cost.
Mm.
We should think of it as progress, as
Yes,
investment,
and
and so
investment
on.
and the clean and healthier future, for ourselves for generations to come. But with that, we have to leave with that. Thank you so much, Glenn, again, for coming on Science Talk and talking about energy emissions, carbon budgets, and all sorts of issues. And I hope that we will enlighten audiences on these some of the issues that, yeah, maybe climate, maybe the carbon budgeting or carbon, capturing is like, or net zero is a scam, but not it's not a complete scam. So just don't be too skeptical about these things. We do as much as possible within our own capacity, and we also keep pushing our governments and legislators to do as much as possible to make this planet more healthier and more cleaner. So with that, thank you so much again. Appreciate your time.